Today I'll show you the best opening for white under 1500, the Scotch Gambit, brought to life by the brilliant Paul Morphy. Now we reach this position starting from the very first king's pawn move. At first, we play standard moves, but then we switch into the Scotch game. After your opponent captures the pawn, you do not recapture. Instead, you play the Scotch Gambit with bishop to c4. The idea is simple. Finish development quickly and launch a full attack. With so many traps built into this opening, it becomes extremely difficult for your opponent even to equalize the game. By the way, notice in this position there is no rook on a1. Just kidding. Someone once told Paul Morphy that was the correct starting setup. Of course, Morphy was the unofficial world champion at the time, and there were very few players who could offer him any resistance, so he even played odd games where he gave up a rook right from the start. Anyway, after bishop to c4, your opponent has several choices. In this game, his opponent Lowenthal played bishop to b4 with check. A very tempting move. We'll analyze that in a moment. But keep in mind, most of the time your opponents will go for one of the two main alternatives, either bishop to c5 or knight to f6. Let me show you exactly how to handle all these responses so you can crush the Scotch Gambit with confidence. Now, if your opponent chooses to play bishop to c5, a very natural move, defending the pawn on d4 and saying, "You are not getting it back," you simply pretend to give up on that idea and instead play pawn to c3, preparing to develop your knight. Your opponent usually thinks, "Okay, I will capture here," expecting your pawn to recapture. And in most cases, black will indeed capture this pawn, because otherwise it feels like you are going to advance and attack the bishop. So the simplest solution for black is to take. At this point, your opponent expects you to recapture immediately, but instead, you capture the other pawn. When their pawn recaptures, you have the devastating follow-up. Queen to d5 with check. On the next move, you regain your material and launch an attack completely for free, without any real sacrifice. This is crushing, because your opponent's king becomes dangerously exposed, making it very easy for you to continue your attack. That is how you deal with bishop to c5. Now let us look at the other common response, knight to f6. This is another natural move, developing a knight and preparing to castle. But here you can push your pawn forward to attack the knight. Suddenly the knight has no good squares to retreat to, and black does not want to waste time by undeveloping it. If the knight jumps to g4, pretending to attack your pawn on e5, you can simply ignore it and castle. At this point, your opponent is already at a disadvantage because the knight is misplaced. You can always attack it later, and if it retreats all the way back to h6, you can capture it and completely ruin black's pawn structure. And if black tries to capture in the center, they immediately run into trouble due to the pin along the e-file, with the knight directly attacked and no safe way to resolve the situation. You simply play pawn to f4, and since the knight is still pinned to the king, it cannot escape. On the very next move, you are going to win the piece and the game. This shows just how easily you can punish natural but careless moves. Back to the actual game, black played bishop to b4 with check, which looks very natural. In this position, you do not want to waste time covering your king with a defensive move. Instead, you play pawn to c3, staying true to the gambit style and prioritizing fast development. After your opponent captures, you have two strong options. One is to recapture with the pawn, which gives you a tempo to attack the bishop. But what Paul Morphy did is even more interesting. He simply castled, allowing his opponent to capture. And indeed, in the game, black took the pawn. If they had not, you could have recaptured with the knight and immediately jumped forward, or recaptured with the pawn and gained a tempo. So black captured, and now although white is technically 2 pawns down, and in this game even a rook down, you have a massive lead in development and enormous attacking chances. For instance, the bishop from b2 is already aiming at the pawn on g7, x-raying the rook on h8. Strangely enough, it is not easy for black to defend against this simple threat. If black tries to block with the knight, you can just push your pawn forward, and once again the knight has no safe squares. It becomes vulnerable everywhere. For example, if the knight steps aside, moves like queen to d5 come into play, targeting the pawn as well as the knight, while your bishop also joins the attack. Already at this stage, black is in serious trouble. Wherever the knight goes, it is going to be in trouble. And if it is not knight to f6, then what else can black really do to defend the pawn? Playing pawn to f6 is quite ugly. It weakens the position and opens up the long diagonal, meaning black will not be able to castle, since our bishop controls the square. Another option would be moving the king, but that leaves the king stuck in the center of the board without the possibility of castling. In the actual game, black ultimately decided to retreat the bishop all the way back to f8. Of course, it is always a bit sad when your opponent plays such a passive move. You almost want to encourage them to play knight back to b8 next and just start a new game, But anyway, in this game, bishop to f8 was played, and as we can see, it actually made some sense. Then Paul Morphy played pawn to e5, essentially saying, "You are not going to develop your knight so easily." And indeed, black immediately faced difficulties in completing development. Black tried pawn to d6, hoping to trade off the central pawn. Morphy calmly responded with rook to e1, aiming directly at the king and increasing the pressure. After black captured on e5, Morphy recaptured. Now came a very interesting moment. In the game, black decided to capture on d1 with the queen, because usually trading queens is considered the best way to neutralize an attack. Without queens, the opponent's attacking chances are reduced. But an interesting question arises here. What if black had instead played knight takes e5 first? What would white do in that case? Well, hopefully, Paul Morphy would have found the crushing continuation that immediately wins the game. I will give you a couple of seconds to try and spot the winning move yourself. The best move is not to simply recapture the knight, but instead to play bishop takes f7. This move is brilliant because the knight is pinned, so black cannot capture the bishop with the knight. The king is forced to move, and once it does, the queen on d8 becomes undefended, allowing white to capture it. From there, white is winning, already up in material, with the knight still under attack. If the knight moves, then queen to e8 delivers checkmate. That is how white could completely crush black in just a few moves. In the actual game, however, black chose to capture the queen. At first sight, this looks almost like a winning move for black, because if white simply recaptures, black remains ahead by a rook. Remember, Paul Morphy had given his opponent that rook advantage before the game started, so rook to d1 is not an option here. Instead, Morphy found a powerful in-between move. Bishop takes f7 with check. Now the question becomes, how can black respond? Moving the king onto the d-file is a disaster, because white would then recapture the queen with check. Although computers suggest this is the strongest defensive move, from a human perspective it does not feel right. For instance, if black tried to block with the bishop, white could trade knight with check to the king and then carry out the long-term threat of bishop takes on g7, attacking the rook and regaining material. That is most likely what black calculated and why he avoided this line. Instead, in the actual game, his opponent played king to e7, probably still expecting white to simply recapture the queen. However, Paul Morphy instead found a brilliant and creative idea. Rather than recapturing, he played knight to g6, a sudden move that does not immediately win material but delivers a powerful double check. And whenever there is a double check, the only possible move is for the king to escape. If the king tries to step aside, white would once again recapture the queen with check, and the rook would also be hanging, which is already losing. But the real question is, what happens if black simply captures the bishop? That is exactly what happened in the game. Black took the bishop, but then came the stunning move knight takes on h8, which was not only a capture but actually checkmate. There is a famous saying that a knight on the rim is dim, but in this case the knight on the rim became the brilliant reality that ended the game for black. And that's how Paul Morphy's brilliant tactics in the Scotch Gambit crushed the opponent, fast, sharp, and unstoppable. Thanks for watching.